You can be witty, relatable, and badass, but a hero is ever only as good as the villain who opposes him. Thankfully, Die Hard has one of the most iconic villains in cinema history. Hans Gruber, brought to life by the late, great Alan Rickman in, get this, his very first motion picture role. There are a bunch of reasons why Hans works so well as an antagonist here, as the opposite to McClane, as this person that we're not even entirely sure can be beaten, but we want beaten oh so badly. And a lot of these really boil down to his character. He's classy, he's sophisticated, he's obviously well educated, and perhaps most importantly, he's smart. And we're not just told this, like, there's not a guy spouting off like, oh yeah, he's like the smartest leader I've ever had. No, we are told this, and we are told this repeatedly throughout the entire film. It's really subtle in a lot of ways. The way he kind of just calls out the John Phillips suit, that Alexander speech of his, how he pieces everything together and comes up with the strategy kind of off the cuff, like shoot the glass.
Schieß dem Fenster. Shoot the glass.
Not everybody would have shot the glass, and that was the blonde guy, whatever his name is. He looks at him and is like dumbfounded, like, why would I shoot the glass? Of course you shoot the glass, the guy's not wearing any shoes, but Hans is working on another level, and all of these scenarios make it obvious that he is in charge, that he can figure things out. He's not just another terrorist nobody. He's not this no-name robber. But the big one, the big character moment, comes about 3/4 of the way through the film. When we get that turn, that moment when the FBI thinks they're going to one-up and terrify Hans by cutting the power. And you realize, as a viewer, that his plan was entirely counting on that. That is how advanced his plan is, how cunning, how brilliant. But if that were it probably still wouldn't be enough to put Hans in that upper echelon of villainy. Okay, so the guy knows how to make a good plan. Sure, he can call on a suit. Okay, I can probably recognize a branded suit if I'm buying the same brand. It's not a big deal. But then we get when Hans met McClane.
Hi there.
A scene missing from the original screenplay and only added because the producers heard Rickman's American accent. And because they wanted the two characters to meet before the inevitable climax. But just like that, Hans sees McClane, sees him without his shoes on, puts two and two together, and adopts this persona, adopts this accent, and starts pretending to be this dude, Bill Clay, William Clay up on the board. But he adopts this persona, and you realize just how advanced he is, how prepared he is at all times. And you realize as a viewer that McClane doesn't realize who he's dealing with right here. He doesn't know that this is a bad guy, or so it seems. And then McClane gives him a gun, and you're like sitting there screaming at him, like, what are you doing giving him a gun? Don't give him a gun. That's Hans. He's gonna... Why are you giving Hans a gun? Right? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Of course, if you're watching this video, you know that the gun is empty, right? It doesn't have any bullets in it. And if you didn't, again, well, spoilers. Don't be watching a movie, a show, an episode about Die Hard, dissecting Die Hard if you're not expecting some spoilers, right? But why doesn't the gun have any bullets? Was it just fortuitous planning? Was McClane working on a different level? Did he just guess well? Why would he give a potentially useful ally an empty, useless weapon? It's not a mistake. It's not happenstance. McClane, in that scene, knows that Hans is lying. He knows Hans is one of them. He knows this is a fact. He knows it. There's no dancing around it. He knows it. Now, let me explain how he knows it. When Die Hard started filming, the ending wasn't set in stone. So the script was being shot as it was written. They started shooting it from the beginning of the script straight through to the end. And so one of the early scenes that they shot, one of the early scenes that was in one of the earlier screenplays, had all of the terrorists, Hans and all of his men, synchronizing their watches. And that is key because in that scene we realize that all of them are wearing the same Tag Heuer watch. So the movie's going on, the movie's progressing, and eventually McClane kills his first terrorist. The one with the, ho ho ho, now I have a machine gun sweatshirt on. But McClane, before he sends the body down, he searches the body, and what does he happen to notice on the guy's wrist? That Tag Heuer watch. Which is also nice, it kind of gives a callback back to Ellis giving Holly the watch, and kind of gives an idea of why he happens to be noticing the watch. See, it's all integrated there. But, McClane's fighting these terrorists, and he's going about his business, and he just happens to keep noticing that these people are wearing this watch. And so when Hans and McClane meet up, you know what Hans is wearing, right? Yeah, you bet. So despite his smarts, despite his meticulous planning, despite the fact that he seems to come from this super hive of upscale villainy, Hans was beaten by this street cop who has a penchant for noticing the small things, like everybody wearing the same watch. So Hans was just defeated by the fact that somebody forgot to buy a wristwatch, variety pack. You do remember all this from the movie, right? You remember all these scenes? No? Wonder why. Well, it's because all of those scenes were cut from the movie. Because of a last-minute idea that Stephen E. D'Souza had to have the robbers, the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, escape in an ambulance. And you see that ambulance later on in the film. It's that one that, Argyle drives a limo into. Even though the truck that they came in on was too small to fit the ambulance inside of it. A fact which apparently still haunts production designer Jackson Nagoya to this day. But the other problem with the ambulance scene, there was no ambulance scene in that initial watch synchronization scene. It wasn't there. So, unable to explain how this ambulance suddenly appeared out of nowhere, they had to cut that initial scene. Why they couldn't go back and just refilm it, I couldn't say. All of this information came out years after Die Hard was released. It came from Degovia, actually. He kind of spilled the beans and said this was something that happened and we had to cut it. I'm not saying that because I want to qualify the statement. It seems absolutely plausible, but I want to get the facts out there. D'Souza also put out another little tidbit about this script when he was writing it. I think it was in the same interview, but he said he wrote the script as if Hans were the protagonist. Now, that doesn't mean that Hans is the hero. Don't get me wrong. Hans is not the hero. McClane is very, very obviously our hero. But in this context, it means that Hans was basically the main character. He was our driving character. As D'Souza told Creative Screenwriting, it's Hans Gruber who plans the robbery. If he had not planned the robbery and put it together, Bruce Willis would have just gone to the party and reconciled, or not, with his wife. So Hans is the reason that we have a movie, and Hans is the reason why McClane evolves as a character, as a person, as a husband. And when you have such an enigmatic character actor such as Alan Rickman, I guess you just kind of go for it, right? Certainly they had to have gotten what they paid for. Keep in mind, again, this is his major motion picture debut, so they probably got him on the cheap. And if you don't think they got what they paid for, just look at the way he conveys that kind of raw sophistication and that downright just brutality, all without doing much. He's kind of like the Christopher Reeve of this generation, the way that Christopher Reeves would go from Clark Kent to Superman. Like, he does this. Alan Rickman does this with Hans. And he probably also has one of the best acted deaths on film. And that's because it wasn't really acted so much, it was real, actual fear on his face that you see in the movie. Because director John McTiernan decided to drop him earlier than Alan Rickman was told he would be dropped because John McTiernan wanted that look on his face. And they nailed it with that very first take. Yeah, I would be scared too. And coupling it with that line from Paul Gleason's Dwayne T. Robinson, that
I hope that's not a hostage.
utter perfection. Oh, hats off to you guys. Which makes it something of a shame that that is not the final confrontation. It's a bit marred by Carl's sudden appearance at the very end, his reappearance there. Even if that does give Powell a nice character beat, couldn't we have just left Carl dangling upstairs? And it's honestly, this is probably one of the only flaws, writing wise and probably just movie wise, in the entire film. And it's a crappy flaw, but I mean, God, there's so much good around it, so who cares?